The ship was called the Ardent Horizon, and it was the proudest thing humanity had ever built. It carried 43 crew members, 3 diplomatic envoys, 1 robotics engineer who had never been to space before, and a 19-year-old cadet named Don Mercer, who had won his seat on the ship by scoring the highest marks in systems engineering at the Nairobi Space Academy 3 years in a row. Nobody famous was on that ship. Nobody powerful was on that ship. The most important person on that ship, it would turn out, was the teenager sitting in the engine room, eating a protein bar, and reading a manual about Vorath power grid architecture. Not because anyone told him to, but because he thought it was interesting. The Ardent Horizon had been in FTL travel for 6 weeks when the wall of ships appeared. They did not appear slowly. One moment, there was nothing ahead. Black space, cold stars, the quiet hum of the engines. The next moment, there were 11 Vorath warships, arranged in a perfect formation that blocked every possible route forward. The crew had 3 seconds to react before the communications board lit up. The voice that came through the speaker was flat and mechanical. The words translated into Standard Galactic by a system that had been doing this for 400 years and was thoroughly bored by it. Vessel of unregistered origin, you have entered collective space without prior authorization, without a civilizational license, and without a registered threat classification. You will power down your engines. You will not transmit on any frequency. You will submit to standard assessment protocol. Failure to comply will be treated as a hostile act. Ambassador Yara Chen stood at the front of the bridge and looked at the 11 warships on the screen. She had spent 30 years preparing for first contact. She had written papers on it, given lectures about it. Lost. Sleep over it. She said, very calmly, cut the engines. The Vorath were not a cruel species in the way that word is usually used. They did not enjoy pain. They did not celebrate suffering. They were something far more dangerous. They were efficient. They had been policing the galaxy for 400 years, and in that time they had encountered over 200 species attempting interstellar travel for the first time. Of those 200 species, 173 had been quietly absorbed into the collective as junior members after going through the standard assessment protocol. 22 had been reclassified as non-sapient and relocated. 4 had been destroyed. 1, the Keth, had managed to negotiate a partial sovereignty agreement after a legal process that lasted 60 years. The Vorath did not expect humanity to be any different. Their initial scan of the Ardent Horizon told them almost everything they thought they needed to know. The crew was soft-bodied, bilaterally symmetrical, and had an average lifespan of roughly 90 years, which the Vorath found almost pitifully short. Their technology was functional but primitive by collective standards, about 200 years behind the current benchmark. Their weapons were present, but small. Their ship had no shielding worth mentioning. The Vorath assessor assigned to the case was a senior official named Delegate Surath Vey, and when he reviewed the initial report, he did something that would later be considered one of the most catastrophic mistakes in collective history. He yawned. He assigned humanity a threat index of Class 2, soft-boned Terrans, which sat between the Myralin fungi clusters at Class 1 and the Dorothai herd species at Class 3. Class 2 was the second lowest possible classification. It meant harmless, manageable, unlikely to cause problems. Crew of the Ardent Horizon was taken off their ship in groups and moved to the Vorath Regional Assessment Installation, a massive station that hung in the dark between 2 dead stars and had been processing newly discovered species for over a century. The installation was clean, it was organized, it was absolutely designed to make every living thing inside it feel small. Ambassador Chen was separated from the crew almost immediately and placed in a diplomatic processing suite that was comfortable in the way a very well-designed trap is comfortable. The crew was moved to general holding, large, featureless rooms with benches along the walls and pale lighting that never changed. Don Mercer sat down on one of the benches, looked at the ceiling, and started mentally mapping the power conduits he could see running behind the wall panels. He had read a lot about Vorath architecture. He noticed that the panel nearest to him was held in place by 4 standard tension fasteners that would take about 40 seconds to remove with the right tool. He did not have the right tool yet. He looked at the buckle on his boot. He thought, that might work. He did not do anything about it right then. He just noted it. That was the thing about Don Mercer that the Vorath would never fully understand. He did not make plans in the dramatic, announced way that shows up in stories. He just noticed things. He stored information. He filed it away quietly, the way a person might pick up a rock during a walk. Not because they need it right now, but because rocks are useful and you never know. The first real incident happened on the 3rd day. A Vorath guard, young, broad-shouldered, visibly bored, was moving through the holding area doing a standard check when he passed Senior Technician Osei Kwabena, who was sitting with his arm wrapped in a field dressing because he had taken a hard fall during the transfer and bruised something badly. Kwabena did not do anything threatening. He did not move. He was just sitting there, tired and in pain, and the guard looked at him the way someone looks at furniture they find mildly in the way. Then the guard hit him. Not hard enough to do serious damage. Just a sharp, flat strike across the shoulder that was clearly meant to say, "Move over, sit straighter, you are in my space." The holding area went very quiet. Then Don Mercer stood up. He was not the biggest person in the room. He was not the most senior. He was a teenager in a gray cadet uniform with a protein bar wrapper still in his pocket. He walked across the room, stopped 3 meters from the guard, and looked directly at him. The guard was roughly twice Mercer's mass. The guard had a neural baton on his belt. The guard had backup that could arrive in under 2. Mercer looked at all of this, and it did not appear to change anything for him. He stood there, and he looked at the guard the way a person looks at a problem they are deciding how to solve. The guards stared back. There was a long moment where neither of them moved. The guard said something in Vorath that the room's translation system rendered as "return to your position, sub-adult." Mercer did not return to his position. He said, in plain English, that the translation system caught and rendered into standard galactic. Touch him again, and we are going to have a very different conversation. The guard did not hit him. Later, the guard filed a report about the incident. In the report, he described Mercer's behavior as anomalous threat display from subadult specimen, no physical action taken, no weapon used, recommend observation. Surath Vey read the report. He read it twice. He found it interesting, in the way a Mercer scientist finds an unexpected lab result interesting. Not alarming, not important, just worth watching. He flagged Mercer for closer monitoring. He authorized what the Vorath called a compliance assessment. He was not worried. He was not nervous. He was simply going to establish the hierarchy clearly, quickly, and efficiently, the way the Vorath had done with 173 species before this one. He had no reason to think this would go any differently. He had every reason to think that one pulse would be enough. He had never been so wrong about anything in his life. The assessment chamber was at the center of the installation. Not physically. Physically it was located on the 7th level, 3rd corridor, behind a door that had no markings on it at all. But it was at the center of everything the Vorath did here. Because everything they did here was aimed at one outcome, and that outcome happened in that room. The room was white. Not bright white, a dull, flat, institutional white that had no warmth in it at all. The floor was smooth. The ceiling was low. There were no windows. There were 2 Vorath guards standing against the far wall, and there was Delegate Surath Vey seated at a small desk near the corner. And there was a single chair in the middle of the room that had restraint cuffs built into the arms and a metal headrest that could lock into position. Don Mercer was brought in by 2 guards who were not rough with him. because roughness was not the point. Procedure? The point was that this happened to everyone, and it always ended the same way, and there was nothing special about this particular soft-boned Terran that would make today any different from the 400 years of identical days that had come before it. Mercer looked at the chair. He looked at the room. He sat down when they gestured for him to sit. Because fighting before you understand the terrain is how you waste energy, and Mercer had read enough to know that. The restraints clicked into place around his wrists. The headrest locked. SciFy did not look up from his desk immediately. He finished writing something, set down his stylus, and then looked at Mercer, the way a person looks at a form they need to process before lunch. "This is standard assessment protocol," SciFy said, and the translator turned his words into flat, correct English. "All newly encountered species undergo this process. It establishes baseline, behavioral parameters, and determines your classification tier. It is not personal." Mercer said nothing. "You will experience a neural compliance stimulus," SciFy continued. "It is calibrated to your species' estimated pain threshold. Most subjects find it unpleasant but manageable. The correct response is to remain still and wait for it to end." Mercer looked at him. Not with fear, not with anger, with the flat, steady, evaluating look of someone who is paying attention and storing information. SciFy nodded to the guard on the left. The guard activated the compliance unit. What happened next took about 4 seconds. The pulse hit Mercer like the entire world's electricity decided to visit his nervous system all at once. It was not a small pain. It was not a clean pain. It was the kind of pain that whites out your vision and fills your ears with a sound that is not really a sound and makes every muscle in your body try to go in a different direction at the same time. Mercer went down. The restraints held him mostly upright, but his whole body bent forward. His head dropped, and he made a sound that was raw and short and honest. Then the 4 seconds ended. The room was quiet. SciFy picked up his stylus and made a note. "Standard response," he wrote. "Pain tolerance within predicted parameters for Class 2 designation. Compliance phase proceeding normally." He waited. The standard protocol allowed 2 minutes for the subject to recover and submit. To straighten up, look down, avoid eye contact, make the body language of an animal that has decided the fight is not worth it. 30 seconds passed. Mercer's hands were shaking. His breathing was rough. Then he straightened up, slowly, not dramatically, not like a hero in a story who stands up and delivers a speech. He just straightened up, the way a person straightens up when they decide they are going to straighten up, one muscle at a time, teeth together, eyes forward. SciFy stopped writing. The guard on the left looked at the guard on the right. Mercer's eyes found SciFy's across the room and stayed there. SciFy had processed 119 species through this room over his career. He had never seen a Class 2 organism do this. He checked his records. He checked them again. Class 2 species, the soft, short-lived, fragile ones, universally submitted within 45 seconds of the first pulse. Not one of them had ever straightened back up. He made a new note: anomalous recovery, non-submissive posture maintained, recalibrating. He said, keeping his voice level, "A second stimulus will now be administered at increased intensity. I recommend you do not resist it. Resistance will only extend the process." Mercer said, "Go ahead." "Way you tell someone to open a door." SciFy looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded to the guard again. The second pulse was stronger. It was calibrated for a species 2 threat tiers above humanity's classification. It was the kind of pulse the Vorath used on Keth's subjects when negotiations became difficult. It was, by any reasonable standard, far more than a 19-year-old human body should have been able to process and remain conscious. Mercer went down harder this time. The sound he made was worse. His whole body shook, and the restraints strained, and his head came forward and hit the headrest lock with a crack that echoed in the small room. The 4 seconds felt longer this time. When the pulse stopped, the room was completely silent. Surath Vey held his stylus and did not write anything. He watched. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. The guards were very still. Sound started quietly. So quietly that Surath Vey thought at first it was mechanical. Some vibration from the equipment. Something in the walls. But it was coming from the chair. It was coming from Mercer. It was a low, continuous sound from somewhere in his chest. And as Surath Vey watched, Mercer's hands, still shaking, fingers white against the restraints, pressed flat against the armrests. And he pushed himself upright. The movement was slow. It cost him something visible. His face was pale, and there was a line of blood on his forehead from where he had hit the headrest lock, and his entire body was shaking, with the kind of shaking that happens when a nervous system has been through something it was not designed to enjoy. But he was upright, and the low sound continued, and Surath Vey realized, with a slow and spreading discomfort that he had never felt in this room before, that the sound was not an expression of pain, was something else. Something the translator was struggling with. It kept cycling through options: distress vocalization, threat display, territorial signal, unknown. The translator settled on non-linguistic aggression indicator. Mercer lifted his head. His eyes found Surath Vey again, and he said 7 words in standard galactic. Calm, flat, each one placed carefully like a stone being set into a wall. Is that everything you have got, then? The room was completely silent. Surath Vey sat very still. He looked at the human in the chair, this small, soft, short-lived creature with blood on his face and shaking hands. And for the first time in a 20-year career, he did not know what to write in the notes. He updated the threat classification to Class 4, pending full review. He sent a message to his superiors marked urgent. He wrote, "Subadult specimen has not submitted after 2 maximum calibrated compliance. Pulses, non-submissive posture maintained. Translator unable to classify vocal behavior. Recommend review of initial species assessment or authorization for escalation." The response came back in 40 minutes. It said, "Escalate. Make an example. Class 2 designations do not resist twice. If the subadult is anomalous, correct the anomaly publicly. The other detainees are watching, and compliance culture must be maintained." Surath Vey read the message. He read it again. He looked at the note he had made, "Recommend review of initial species assessment." He had meant it as a professional suggestion. His superiors had read it as a sign of weakness. He sent back a confirmation. He started preparing the atrium demonstration. He told himself that this was standard. He told himself that he had done this before and it had always worked. He told himself that the human was just an anomaly, a statistical outlier. Single data point that didn't change the overall picture. He almost believed it. What he could not explain, and what he did not include in any of his reports, was the thing that had happened in his chest when Mercer looked at him from that chair. It was not fear exactly. He did not have a word for it in his language. It was the feeling you get when you are very sure about something, and then you look closer and realize you cannot actually see the bottom. Senior Archivist Thesson Orr had worked for the Vorath Collective Intelligence Division for 31 years, and in that time he had written threat profiles on 62 species. He was good at his job. He was patient, he was thorough, and he had a particular skill for reading between the lines of raw data and finding the thing that the numbers were trying to say. When Surath Vey's urgent message came through and landed on his desk, alongside an emergency order to produce a full threat assessment on humanity within 72 hours, Thesson Orr did not panic. He made tea, he sat down. He opened the raw scan data from the Ardent Horizon intercept, and he started reading. The first thing he noticed was the biology file. It was not unusual for a Class 2 species to have an interesting biology. Most soft-bodied species had evolved some clever trick or another to survive their homeworld. But Earth's file was not interesting In the way a curiosity is interesting. It was interesting in the way a warning sign in a language you don't speak is interesting. He read about Earth's biosphere, and then he read it again, because the first time he thought the translation must have made an error. Warfare system, an immune response, that the collective had only seen in far older and more developed species. And a geological history of volcanic eruptions, ice ages, and solar radiation events that would have sterilized most inhabited worlds 3 times over. And through all of it, the humans had not retreated. They had not specialized into a niche. They had not evolved a shell, or a shell equivalent, or a chemical deterrent, or any of the standard biological escape strategies. They had simply gotten better at surviving everything. Fess and Orr pulled up their medical history next. What he found was that humans had, within a very short time by galactic standards, cured or neutralized most of the diseases that had been killing them for their entire existence. Not by making their bodies more resistant to those diseases in the way evolution usually handled such things, but by inventing solutions from scratch. They had looked at a thing that was killing them and said, "We will figure out how this works, and then we will stop it." And then they had done exactly that, repeatedly, for everything. He noted that at the same time they were developing medicine to extend life, they were developing weapons to end it faster. He noted this was not a contradiction to them. He noted they seemed to view it as 2 sides of the same coin, understanding how systems work well enough to control them in either direction. Then he found the section on their cultural mythology and their animals, and he found a small entry that stopped him completely. It was about an animal from the sub-Saharan region of Earth's largest continent. The animal was called a honey badger. It weighed approximately 12 kilograms. It was, by any objective measure, not a remarkable animal in terms of size or physical capability. There were hundreds of larger, stronger predators sharing its habitat. Remarkable was its behavior. Fess and Orr read the documentation carefully. The honey badger had been documented absorbing bites from venomous snakes that would kill larger animals, going unconscious from the venom, and then waking up and continuing to fight. It had been documented absorbing electrical shocks from human agricultural fencing, and then returning to the same fence multiple times. It had been documented fighting animals 3 and 4 times its size. Not because it was strong enough to win in a conventional sense, but because it did not have a functional instinct for retreat. It simply did not stop. And then Fess and Orr found the part that genuinely disturbed him. The humans knew about this animal. They had studied it, documented it, made visual recordings of it, and they did not find it alarming. They found it funny. They found it admirable. There were thousands of cultural references to it. The honey badger as a symbol of resilience, stubbornness, and the refusal to accept that a situation was unwinnable. They made images of it. They put it on clothing. Young humans referenced it when they wanted to say, "I do not give up." Fess and Orr set down his tea. He pulled up the behavioral file on Don Mercer. Subadult male, 19 years old, junior cadet rank, no combat training on record, no exceptional physical classification. He read Surith Vey's account of the first pulse. He read about Mercer standing back up. He read about the second pulse. He read about Mercer standing back up again. He read about the 7 words, "Is that everything you have got then?" He sat for a long time. Then he opened a new document and started writing his report. He wrote about the biology, the planet that tried to kill them, the diseases they cured, the predators they outlasted, medicine and the ice ages, and the extinctions. He wrote about the concept he had found in their social psychology literature called spite, the documented human behavior of accepting personal harm in order to ensure that the thing that harmed them first was also harmed, a behavior that made no rational sense from a survival standpoint, and yet was deeply and consistently present across all human cultures. He wrote about the honey badger. He spent a long paragraph on the honey badger. He wrote about what it meant that a species chose that animal as a symbol. He wrote about what it meant that a 19-year-old with no combat training and no weapons, strapped into a compliance chair in the most controlled environment the collective operated, had absorbed 2 escalating pulse treatments that would have broken a Kef soldier, and had then looked at Delegate Surath Vey and asked if that was everything he had. He wrote his conclusion. He almost deleted it because it sounded dramatic, and he was not a dramatic person. He kept it because it was accurate. We did not capture a diplomatic envoy. We captured a honey badger, and we have now shocked it twice. He submitted the report. Then he sent a separate private message to Surath Vey that said, "Do not administer a third pulse. I am not making a formal recommendation. I am telling you personally and directly, do not do it." Surath Vey read the message 40 minutes after receiving it. He read it 3 times. By then he had already confirmed the atrium demonstration. He told himself that the archivist was being alarmist. He told himself that the report was interesting, but theoretical, and that theory was not the same as practice. He told himself that the compliance protocol had worked on every species it had ever been applied to, and there was no logical reason to believe this one would be different. Meanwhile, in his holding cell, Don Mercer sat on the floor against the wall. His head hurt. His hands had mostly stopped shaking. He had the boot buckle in his palm. He was looking at the wall panel with the 4 standard tension fasteners. He pressed the buckle against the first fastener. It fit. He turned it slowly. The fastener turned. He did not open the panel. He just confirmed that he could. Then he put the buckle back in his boot, lay down on the floor, closed his eyes, and went to sleep. Not because he was not worried. Not because he had a full plan worked out. But because he was 19 years old, and his body had been through 2 compliance pulses today, and rest was a resource, and you did not waste resources. He had learned that from his father. His father had grown up poor, and his father's favorite saying was, "Rest when you can, work when you must, and never let anyone see." The whole picture. Don Mercer had grown up watching nature documentaries too. His favorite had been about the honey badger. He had watched the episode where the honey badger got bitten by a cobra, went unconscious, woke up, shook itself off, and went straight back to eating the cobra, and he had laughed and felt something deep in his chest that he could not name but that felt like recognition. He slept. In the Collective Intelligence Division, Thesson Orr waited for a response to his private message to Surath Vey. No response came. He poured another cup of tea. He did not drink it. He looked at the wall. He thought about the honey badger. He thought about a species that looked at an animal which got shocked and kept coming back and said, "Yes, that is us. That is what we are. We put that on our clothing." He thought about the line in his report. "We have now shocked it twice." What came after twice? He decided he was not going to sleep tonight. Part 4. The Growl Before the Storm. Word traveled fast inside the installation, not through any official channel. The Vorath did not allow detainees access to communication systems, but through the informal, invisible network that forms wherever living things are kept together in close spaces and have nothing to do but watch and whisper. By the morning after the compliance chamber, every species in the installation's general population knew about the human. They knew a soft-bodied Class II subadult had been given a double-pulse compliance treatment. They knew he had stood back up twice. They knew what he had said. The stories passed from holding room to holding room, through whatever method each species had. The Keth used a low subsonic vibration through the floor that the Vorath monitoring systems did not register as communication. The Myrilin fungi clusters spread information through spore traces left on shared surfaces, simply told their herd members in quiet voices during the periods when the guards were at the far end of the corridor. By the time morning shift began, the entire installation knew. The reactions were different depending on the species. The younger Keth detainees, the ones who had been brought in recently, and had not yet had the compliance protocol fully break their instinct for resistance, found it exciting, in the way that impossible things are exciting. The Myrilin clusters, which processed information collectively and took a long time to form opinions, began a slow-growing pattern of spore activity that their keepers did not recognize as unusual, but which was, in fact, the fungi cluster equivalent of very intense conversation. The Dorothi Elder, a creature named Vas Heron, who had not spoken in 11 years, and who sat in the same corner of the same holding room every single day with her eyes on the floor, raised her head when she heard the calling. Story. She did not say anything. She just raised her head, and among her herd, that was significant enough that the younger Dorothi moved closer to her without being asked. The humans themselves were not told what was coming. Mercer was collected from his cell at the start of the mid-shift by 4 guards, 4, not 2, which Mercer noted, and walked through corridors he had not been through before. He mapped them as he walked. Right turn, left turn, 40 steps, a junction, right again, a wide door that required the guard in front to use a secondary access credential. He filed all of it. The atrium was the largest space in the installation. It was not beautiful. It was purely functional. A tall-ceilinged room with a smooth floor and tiered observation ledges along 3 walls where guards could stand and watch the open space below. But on this morning, the observation ledges were not full of guards. On this morning, the blank, tiered ledges were full of detainees. Every species in the installation's general population had been moved to the atrium for what the Vorath morning shift announcement called a standard community assessment demonstration, mandatory attendance. The Vorath understood, in their efficient way, that compliance culture was not just about the individual being processed. It was about everyone watching the individual being processed. 100 species had been made orderly, not because every single member of those species had personally experienced the compliance chamber, but because they had watched someone else go through it and understood what the Vorath could do. Surath Vey stood at the front of the atrium floor. He had his notes, he had his posture. He had 4 years of experience running public demonstrations. He had a compliance unit that was calibrated for the highest setting he was authorized to use. He did not have Thessanor's private message open in front of him because he had decided not to think about it. Mercer was brought to the center of the atrium floor, and the restraint apparatus, a standing frame this time, not a chair, was locked around his wrists and across his chest. He could not move much. He could move his head. He looked around the atrium. He looked at the observation ledges. He saw hundreds of alien faces looking back at him. He saw the Keth detainees in their section, gray-blue, broad-faced, built like something that had once been much larger and been compressed, watching with the careful stillness of people who had learned that showing emotion was a cost they couldn't afford. He saw the Dorothi Elder in her corner of her ledge, her enormous dark eyes fixed on him. He saw things he could not name, because he had not studied every species the Voroth had ever detained, and there were many of them. He looked at all of them, looked at Surath Vey. Surath Vey began the standard public demonstration speech. He explained the protocol. He explained the purpose. He explained that this was not punishment. It was classification. And that classification served the order of the collective, and that order served everyone. He was very practiced at this speech. It was a good speech. It had worked many times. He finished the speech. He nodded to the guard. The pulse hit. The atrium was silent. When you watched a compliance pulse from a distance, it was not dramatic in the physical sense. The subject shook, made a sound, went still. What made it land in the chest of every watcher was not the sight of it. It was the sound. And the sound Mercer made in that atrium, raw and short and completely honest, went up into the high ceiling and came back down, and sat on everyone in the room like a physical weight. The Dorothy Elder closed her eyes. The young Keth detainees did not move. The Miraland clusters went very still. The atrium was so quiet that the hum of the installation's air systems was suddenly audible. Surath Vey watched. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. 30 seconds. Mercer's head was down. His whole body was angled forward in the restraint frame, hands gripping the wrist locks. 40 seconds. Surath Vey began to write. Subject response within normal parameters for. Then the sound started. It came from Mercer's chest. It was low. It was continuous. It built slowly, the way a fire builds slowly when the wood is good. Not a burst, not a spike, just a steady and unstoppable increase. The translator swept across it, cycling through categories, finding nothing that fit. The sound filled the atrium. It went into the walls and came back. Mercer raised his head. His face was pale and there were tears on it. Not from emotion. The body produces tears involuntarily under that kind of neurological stress. And there was dried blood on his forehead from the previous day, and his hands were white against the restraint locks. And the sound continued. Every species in that atrium had a different relationship with sound. Some of them communicated primarily through vibration. Some of them had evolved in silence and were extremely sensitive to audio. Some of them had not heard anything that they could not classify in their entire lives. None of them had a word for what they were hearing, but all of them felt it. The Dorothy Elder opened her eyes. Mercer lifted his head fully, and his eyes found Surath Vey across the atrium floor, and his voice, when it came, was low and direct, and the translator worked through it carefully, and rendered it into standard galactic, word by word. Do it again. The atrium was completely silent. Not the silence of shock exactly. The silence of a room full of living things that have just heard something and are still deciding what it means and whether to believe it. Surath Vey stood very still. He thought about Thessanor's message. He thought about the archivist's report and the honey badger and the line, "We have now shocked it twice." He thought about the Keth on the ledges, the Dorothy Elder, the 100 species watching. He thought about what it would mean if he stopped now. He thought about what it would mean if he continued. He made a decision. It was the wrong decision. He told himself it was the right decision. He nodded to the guard. In the observation ledge, the Dorothy Elder, Vos Haran, who had not spoken in 11 years, who had watched her entire species' resistance get processed out of them, one compliance pulse at a time, who had decided, long ago, that there was nothing left worth saying, turned to the young Dorothy beside her. She said, in her language, 4 words. The translator on the guard's belt caught them and rendered them into standard galactic. What she said was, "I believe him." Then the third pulse fired, and Don Mercer tore the floor open. The third pulse was the strongest one Surath Vey was authorized to use. It was calibrated for a Class 6 organism. Humanity was classified Class 4, pending review. The math did not favor Don Mercer. The pulse hit him, and the sound he made was different from the first two. Bigger, rougher, something that bounced off the atrium walls and came back changed, and his whole body went rigid in the restraint frame, and every person watching on the observation ledges went completely still, because this one looked final. This one looked like it was over. Surath Vey held his stylus. The guard held the compliance unit. The installation held its breath. Then the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a warning. Every light in the atrium cut at once, and the room dropped into darkness so complete that for 2 full seconds nobody could see anything at all. Then the emergency strips along the floor edges activated, a dim red-orange glow. enough to see shapes but not faces. In that dim red light, the restraint frame made a sound. A mechanical, sequential sound. 4 clicks, rapid, like a machine counting down. Then silence. Then the sound of boots on the atrium floor, moving. Sarath Vey could not see clearly enough to track the movement. He could hear it. He reached for his communication device to call backup. His communication device was not working. The power was still out in the walls. Across the room, a guard said, "The restraint system has failed. Subject is loose. I need—" He did not finish the sentence. There was a short, sharp, physical sound, and then the guard sat down on the atrium floor and stayed there. Sarath Vey said, "Seal the exits. Seal the exits now." The exit seals required power to the door systems. The door systems were offline. Here is what had happened. The night before, in his cell, Dawn, Mercer had used a boot buckle to remove a wall panel and spent 40 minutes reading the power routing architecture of the installation's 7th level, 3rd corridor sector. He had found something that the Voroth infrastructure designers had not considered a vulnerability, because it had never been relevant before. The compliance unit drew power from the same local grid node as the restraint systems. When the compliance unit was running at maximum output, as it was during the 3rd pulse, at Class 6 calibration, it pulled enough current from that local node to create a momentary overload condition. The overload condition would, if the right connection was interrupted at the right moment, cascade into a full section shutdown. The right connection was behind the wall panel in the assessment chamber. The assessment chamber was not in the atrium, but the atrium's lighting and restraint systems were on the same section grid. This math, in his head, the previous night, lying on the floor of his cell, while his hands were still shaking from the 2nd pulse. He had done it calmly. He had done it the way his father taught him to do hard things, one step at a time, each step leading to the next. Don't look at the whole thing at once, because the whole thing will paralyze you. Just look at the next step. The next step had been, get to the assessment chamber before the atrium demonstration. He had not been able to do that. So he had adjusted. He had identified the secondary option. The atrium itself had a floor access panel near the restraint frame position, visible during his walk-in, covered by a standard tension grating that was held in place by, he had checked, 3 seconds of looking, 4 standard tension fasteners, identical to the ones in his cell wall. He had a boot buckle in his boot. He had 2 compliance pulses worth of motivation. He had asked for 3rd pulse, specifically because he needed the current spike. He had used the darkness of the first 2 seconds to drop to the floor, remove the boot buckle, release the grating, reach the manual circuit breaker inside the floor access, and interrupt the section connection. He had done it in under 4 seconds. He did not stand up dramatically when the restraints failed. He stood up purposefully, which is different. The first thing he did was move to the nearest guard, not to fight, but to take the guard's access credential, which was on a cord around the guard's neck, and which, during the brief physical interaction in the dark, relocated itself to Mercer's hand. The second thing he did was find the manual door release on the atrium's east wall. Manual releases do not require power. The Vorath had put them in for safety compliance reasons, which was an irony nobody had time to appreciate right now, and open the door. The third thing he did was go and find his crew. His crew was being held in 3 separate sections on levels 4, 5, and 6. He had 22 minutes before the installation's backup power came online. He used all 22 minutes. He ran. He did not stop. He used the access credential to open cell blocks, used his knowledge of the power down map to navigate sections that were still offline, found his crewmates in the order he had mentally organized them based on their cell block locations. Ambassador Chen found him before he found her. She had been working on the lock of her diplomatic suite door for 3 days, using a modified eating utensil, and the door had opened on its own when the power cut, which she considered good timing. She saw Mercer's face. She said, "How bad are you?" He said, "Fine." She looked at him, pale, dried blood on his forehead, moving like someone who was not going to acknowledge that anything was wrong until he was somewhere safe enough to fall apart. And she said, "We'll talk about fine later." He said, "Yes, ma'am." They moved. Here is the other thing that happened in the atrium during those 22 minutes. When the lights went out, and the floor opened, and the restraints failed, and Mercer moved into the darkness, something shifted in the room that had nothing to do with the power grid. The Keth detainees on the upper ledges had watched a Class 2 subadult absorb 3 compliance pulses, and then use the third one to take down the building's power. They had been in this installation for, in some cases, decades. They had been processed through compliance protocol. They had been made orderly. But compliance protocol works on the assumption that resistance is more costly than submission. And what they had just watched was a live demonstration that the math could go the other way. The Keth elder nearest the ledge exit stood up. "Post." The guard post was unmanned. The guards had moved to the atrium floor when the lights cut. He looked at the door. Manual release. He had known where the manual release was for 6 years. He had never used it. He used it now. The Miralin cluster nearest the atrium's west exit made a decision that, in their collective processing, took about 4 seconds and involved input from every member simultaneously. They moved. The Dorothi elder, Voss Heron, did not run. She walked. She walked the way someone walks when they have decided that the place they are going is more real than the place they are leaving. Her herd walked with her. 47 minutes after the lights went out, the Voroth Regional Assessment Installation, 12 levels, 437 cells, 102 staff members, and the most comprehensive detainee processing facility in this sector of the collective, was empty. Breached, not exploded, not destroyed, just empty. Every detainee gone, every exit standing open. The Vorath staff unharmed. Mercer had been very specific about that, had told his crew very clearly, had communicated it through the Keth elder as best he could given the language barrier. No one gets hurt if they don't make it necessary. Most of the staff had not made it necessary. Surath Vey sat in the command chair on the operations level. The power had come back on 11 minutes ago. He had done a full count. He had confirmed the count twice. He was now writing the most difficult report of his career. The message from High Command came in while he was writing. It said, "Status of installation, status of human subadult, confirm current threat classification." Surath Vey looked at the message for a long time. He thought about the honey badger. He thought about Thessenor's line, "We have now shocked it," twice. And he thought about what he had written in response to that. The thing he had told himself. One more pulse. Make an example. The protocol has always worked. He started typing. He wrote, "Installation is currently non-operational. Full general population evacuation occurred during a 47-minute window following power interruption. Staff are unharmed. Human subadult and crew have exited the facility. Human crew are currently broadcasting on all frequencies via a jury-rigged beacon assembled from Vorath's standard components." He paused. He kept writing. He wrote, "I am formally revising the humanity threat classification from Class 4 pending review to unknown. I am recommending immediate diplomatic contact at the highest available level. I am strongly recommending against any further compliance engagement without prior authorization from senior command." He paused again. He looked at what he had written. One more paragraph. "I want to be clear about what I am recommending and why. It is not that this species is dangerous in the conventional sense. They are not larger than us. They are not more technologically advanced. They do not have weapons we cannot match. What I am recommending is that we approach them with the care we would use for something we do not understand. Because I have now observed this species at close range, and I do not understand them. They do not fight because they calculate that they can win. They fight because it does not appear to occur to them that they might not. I do not know what to do with that. I do not think the standard protocols were designed for it. He submitted the report. In the Collective Intelligence Division, Thesson Orr's communication device lit up at the same moment. He read Sir V's report. He sat back in his chair. He thought about the honey badger. He thought about the human cadet eating a protein bar in an engine room 6 weeks ago, reading about Vorath power grid architecture for fun. He thought about a species that survived ice ages and apex predators, and mass extinctions, and viral warfare, and responded to all of it, not by retreating, but by getting better at surviving. He thought about a 19-year-old who had been shocked twice, announced what he was going to do, been shocked a third time, and then done exactly what he announced he was going to do. He opened a new document. At the top he wrote, Supplementary Note, Humanity Threat Assessment. He wrote one line, he looked at it, he did not delete it. If this is what their children do, I have one question for High Command, and the question is, what do their soldiers look like? He submitted it. Outside the installation, in the cold dark between two dead stars, a small beacon blinked steady and bright on all frequencies. It was built from Vorath. Power cells, human communication protocols, a piece of Ambassador Chen's diplomatic suite furniture, and 3 hours of work by a 19-year-old who had once read a manual about Vorath power grid architecture because he thought it was interesting. The signal was simple. It said, Crew of the Ardent Horizon, we are here, we are intact, we are ready to talk, come find us. The galaxy heard it. And somewhere in the High Command Chamber, where very old beings in very important chairs were having a very emergency meeting about what had just happened and what to do next, one of them asked the question that nobody wanted to answer out loud. The question was, humanity has been in interstellar space for 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, they had their ship intercepted, their crew detained, their youngest member run through the harshest compliance protocol the Collective operates. And what they had sent back was not a distress signal. It was not a surrender. It was a beacon that said, come find us, we are ready to talk. The question the very old being in the very important chair asked, into the silence of the emergency meeting, was this. What happens when they have been out here for 6 years? Nobody answered. The beacon kept blinking. Don Mercer sat on the cold ground outside the installation with his back against a rock and his knees up and his head tilted back, looking at the stars. Ambassador Chen sat beside him. She did not ask if he was okay. She already knew the answer to that question was complicated. After a while she said, you planned that from the cell. He said, most of it. She said, the boot buckle. He said, yeah. She looked at him. She said, your dad teach you that? He said, he taught me to always know where the exits are, and always know what the power is doing. He said, he grew up poor. She nodded. They sat in the quiet for a while. Somewhere above them the beacon blinked. Somewhere further above that, the galaxy was deciding what to make of them. Mercer closed his eyes. His hands had stopped shaking. He slept.